Hi, this is Pastor David Johnson at Trinity United Methodist Church, and we're in our second part of Intro to Theology, and we're in week number 3 of our second part. In Intro to Theology Part 2, we're going through the basics of systematic theology, and we're using the Apostles' Creed as our guide in talking about the major doctrines of the church. And so I'm going to start, as we do every week, with a reading of the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. On the third day, he rose from again. He ascended into heaven, is seated at the right hand of the Father, and will come again to judge the living and the dead. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. Amen. Those words are from the modern version of the Apostles' Creed. Again, that creed has been around since the early church, and it comes from the early baptismal covenant responses in the early church. And so the Apostles' Creed is a model. And this week, we are on the statement. We started with I believe, and we talked about faith. Last week, we talked about God the Father Almighty. And this week, we're going to talk about creator of heaven and earth. We're continuing our conversation about God with an important identity marker in the character of God, God the Creator. And first, what I want to talk about, in Intro to Theology 1, we focused on the connection between theology and culture, and how when we do theology, we do it in the context of culture, and some of the ways that we may do theology so that we can speak to the culture. We call that public theology. What I want to highlight tonight is, as I talk about how the church and the people of God have talked about God as creator, you can see that the conversations about God are often shaped by the context that the writers or thinkers or theologians find themselves in. So our very first contact with God as creator, Yahweh the creator, is in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, the earth was formless and void, and God said, "Let there be light." In the beginning, the earth was formless and void. Throughout the Old Testament, there are different conversations about God as creator, and there are two very, very important passages when we think about how does the Old Testament talk about God as creator. And the very first thing we get to is this Genesis chapters 1 through 3 that speak to the creation of all things. And we get this idea that the earth was formless and void, and God began to call order out of chaos. The words there mean sort of a chaotic or unformed thing, and God seems to call order into chaos with the act of creation. Now, there are two ways that creation narrative is worked out. There's the speaking into existence, but also the calling and ordering of things. And so the Old Testament, when it talks about God as creator, it talks about him in this sort of a way of God calling order out of chaos. Another version of this story is in Job, beginning in chapter 38 of the book of Job. If you remember, Job is the story of a man who follows God, whose life falls apart. And we're told that the accuser, the devil, Satan, the accuser has taken it upon himself to challenge whether Job is truly righteous or if he's just following God because of his blessings. And in the end, Job begins to question God, and God says to Job, "Were you there when I created everything? Who did I consult? Were you able to consult with me when I established the boundaries of the world?" And what we get right there is a couple of really important ways the Old Testament talks about God as creator. One, there's a sense of God calling order into chaos and causing the order of the world. But the second part is God as the shaper of all of the things in nature. So not only is God creator, but God also is sustainer. God is able to control nature. And the reason that we want to talk about context is because we need to remember the ancient Hebrew context. In the context of the ancient Near East, where the Hebrew people were coming into their own and flourishing, you will remember that the other tribes around them often worshipped other forces. They worshipped the forces that seemed chaotic around them. You have to imagine that for them, something like a sudden hailstorm or other cataclysmic or global earth-shattering events, major storms or phenomena in the sky. Often those things seem to throw the order of things out of whack. And what they are declaring is that God, their God, Yahweh, is able to bring order to the chaos. When the world seems chaotic, their God is able to bring order to the chaos. But you also remember that the tribes around them often worshipped things in nature. That is, that they would often, there were tribes that might worship the sun or the moon or the stars. And what we get is not just that God is the one who creates all of those things, but that God is still in control of all of those forces. And this is an important aspect. And I want to point out another aspect that is often lost on our modern readers. Creation is often understood in the Old Testament as God's victorious conflict, not only over chaotic forces, but those forces are often depicted as cosmic creatures. So as an example, Behemoth or Leviathan or Nehar or Rahab or Tannim or Yam, all of these ancient names were words to describe physical animals that represented chaotic forces and not earthly animals. Leviathan was the great monster of the deep. And so if you went out into the sea and when boats were lost or suddenly storms arose, tribes might give credit to Leviathan. The ancient Hebrew people weren't necessarily trying to do the theological work of arguing against whether Leviathan really existed. They weren't trying to argue natural sciences. But what they did suggest, like in Job 3:8, Job 7:12, 9:13, and Job 40:15-32, in Zechariah 10:11, and Isaiah 27:1, in Psalm 74:13-15, and in Psalm 139, 10-11, all of these verses over and over again, what we hear is that these chaotic forces, Leviathan or Yam or Nahar, any of those chaotic forces that represented by ancient beasts, God was the master of them. And so for the ancient Hebrew people, God is creator and sustainer of the world, who is master of any chaotic forces that may come to do them harm. And this is a very important aspect of how they develop and establish identity. When you are a small tribe trying to take over a new land, you have to begin in yourself to believe that the God that you worship is able to take on any force that you may come into contact with. And so this is one sense of creation. And then when we get to the New Testament, we get a different context, and so we get different theological arguments about creation, and particularly in the early church. And in the early church, what the context is one in which a Platonic Greek society, the Greco-Roman world is heavily influenced by Platonic thought, which focused on a dualistic nature when it comes to the way the world works. And so what is believed by many is that there is a strict dualism. There's light and dark, and these two things are separate energies, separate forces, completely sort of opposites of each other. There's good and there's evil. There are separate forces that are at work against each other. And even when they think about gods, there might be God must be spirit because the world is matter, and matter and spirit, or matter and soul, are separate. And matter is evil and corrupt, but soul is, or spirit, is pure and good. And what ancient Greco-Roman society, what they wanted to try to suggest is that these dual natures were always at war, and that's how they explain sort of the part of how they explain the chaotic forces around them. And in that context, the Christians begin to try to explain who Yahweh is, how Jesus could be the Son of God, and what that had to do with the notion of God as creator. One example of the way that they talk about this in that society, the reason is elevated as sort of the pathway from matter to the spiritual. And Jesus is depicted, when we read John chapter 1, Jesus is depicted as not only the Son of God, but the Logos, the word and reasoning of God from the very beginning. And so Jesus is the power, the force that calls the world into being. When we read John chapter 1, we read, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. In the beginning was Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And all things came into being by the power of the Logos. Now, for us today, we read the Word was God and was with God, and it misses some of the power, because what they wanted to establish very early on is that this sort of idea of a strict separation between matter and spirit is way off, because the God who is spirit, Jesus who is spirit, is also became matter, which means that creation has goodness in it. Creation is not all evil forces. The world, the material world, is not all bad. In fact, in the beginning, God called it good. We hear all the time, you will hear in churches, sort of the extension of that theology, that we were good in the beginning and that God made the world good. And you hear this sort of positive view on nature. This is crucial to the early church, because they're refuting the idea of a strict separation between matter and spirit. And so in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and that Word called all matter into being. A second idea that crops up is what Aristotle and Plato also, when they thought about God, a God that was creator, they would teach that the world was made up of corrupted matter, and that a good God tried to design from that corrupted matter a world. And so the world is inherently corrupted, but also that God somehow did not make the world by God's self, but in fact took something pre-existent matter, that somehow matter is also eternal and separate from God, and God took that eternal matter to make the world. And so also what Christians wanted to refute is this idea of God creating the world from pre-existent matter as if God needed help. And so in the early church, we also get the idea, and I believe Irenaeus is one of the early proponents of this, but the idea of ex nihilo. Ex nihilo is the idea of creation. It means out of nothing. God created the world out of nothing. That is, that when God began to create the universe, that there was nothing that God had on hand. God did not get sort of the cosmic clay to make the universe. That instead, God speaks and calls all things into being. In the beginning was the Word. The pre-existent nature, the pre-existent thing was the Word, and the Word causes all things into being, and the Word is the Son of God. That's the extrapolation that the early church is trying to establish. So even though Christians can all talk about God as creator, we begin to take sort of different avenues when we think about how does God do the work of creation. There are some early Christians that don't mind the Platonic thought, and so Justin Martyr, who's heavily influenced by that Platonic thought, and is one of the great early philosophers of the church, it has no problem with the idea of sort of a pre-existent matter, but he wants to say that sort of God just makes the pre-existent matter, and that all things are made by God. But this argument in Justin Martyr's world is sort of that God is the divine architect, and so still must be respected. These arguments go back and forth throughout the church and develop. So what does it mean for God to be creator? As they develop, we get some natural consequences from that. So I want to continue. If God is creator, it means that creation is good. We talked about this because it's not some separate force from God. If God is creator, it means there's an argument that begins to sprout up about God. If God is creator and all powerful, then creation is in fact from God's divine will. That it's the divine decision. That God just decided to make the world out of the love and pleasure that God has within God's self. Now, the important aspect of this is when we talk about God as creator and sustainer, what the early church began to say was, and continuing the thought from the Old Testament, that God is both creator and sustainer of the universe, but self-sufficient. That is, that God is self-sustained. Now, the importance of this means that God didn't have to make the world. Some early Greek philosophers would like to suggest that God created the world out of a divine need, that God needed to make the world in order to not be lonely, or God needed to create the world in order to fulfill some sort of inherent nature within God that is beyond God's control. And what the early church says is that God is the creator who creates out of God's own divine decision. That is, out of God's own free will, God creates the universe. So this is a topic that can be debated. Now, if God is creation, is the creator, there also in the early church consequently is a work to try to help people to understand that you worship the creator and not the creation. So as an example, Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verse 25, that the issue of sin for the world is that they worship the creation instead of the creator. It says, and so there's Paul wants to write that we need to have a distinction between creator and creation. Now, One of the issues that comes about from that theology or that teaching is that some Christians over time almost begin to adopt that same early Platonic thought. That is, they begin to say that not only does God create, and we shouldn't worship the creation, but only the creator, but that creation is bad, that it's something to watch out for, that it's something to be wary of. An example of that would be the middle-aged theologian Thomas à Kempis. And Thomas à Kempis wrote in The Imitation of Christ, he says, he writes about the idea of this, of creation as something to be avoided or to guard yourself against. Now, there are other theologians who come before and after Thomas à Kempis that says, no, they want to say that, yes, creation is fallen, that it's not good, that it's not it's not in its perfect state as a result of man's sin, but that God made creation good. So you see, over time, the theology of God as creator is shifted and grows and changes. And right alongside that, one of the most important consequences when we talked about the how in the Old Testament and the early church of God as creator and some of the consequences, but also then one of the most important aspects of God as creator is from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. There's an important verse where God says, and he made humanity, or God made humanity in his own image, or in the image of God, God created them. Man and woman, God created them. And so if God is creator and people are made in the image of that creator, what does that mean about what people are? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And so there's all sorts of debates, and I want to highlight 4 key debates or ideas around what it means to be made in the image of God. The first one, taken up in that Greco-Roman period, is that because humans are made in the image of God, it means that God is sovereign over them. If you recall, there's a story in which someone comes and argues with Jesus about whether or not he pays taxes. And Jesus says, go and get a coin. And he asks, whose face is on the coin? And they say, Caesar's. And he says, rend unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and rend unto God what is God's. Now, if God has stamped us with his image, if God has made humanity in his image, if we have the divine stamp of the creator, an argument is made from the early church because of this practice that when a nation stamps the image of their king on things, it means a way of declaring that king is in charge of that place. That because we have that divine stamp, it means that God is sovereign over us, that God is our divine ruler naturally as a result of us being made in the image of God. So that's one way in which humanity is thought of being in the image of God. That is, that we are God's property, that God has somehow given us a divine LoJack, if you will, and that we belong to God. A second way of talking about what does it mean to be made in the image of God is the idea of the human correspondence with God. This is a classic example of this is from the author C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis talks about the idea of human beings being made in the image of God means that human beings are made to relate to God. That because we are made in the image of God, we are designed to be in connection with God and to have a relationship with God. And because we are designed for that relationship, everything we do in the world is a way of seeking out the fulfillment of that relationship. The image of the Creator, Augustine talks about this too. The image of the Creator, Augustine says, is to be found in the rational or intellectual soul of humanity. So another aspect of God as creator is what Augustine talks about is the intellectual or rational capacity of humanity. That is that C.S. Lewis talks about this relational connection, that we are designed to be in relationship with God. And Augustine talks about the image of God is on us, which means that we are able to be rational. Because God brings order to chaos, we are able to bring order to the world. So Augustine would point to the story of creation and how Adam is called to name the animals, and says that, our divine spark calls us to understand the world around us and to try to make sense of the world around us. That rational calling comes from the divine stamp, according to Augustine. According to C.S. Lewis, the most important aspect of that is that the divine stamp means that we're designed to be in relationship with God, and that whenever we are out of relationship, there's a God-sized hole in every human being that we're trying to fill when we're outside of relationship with God. You've probably heard some of these arguments before. Another argument about what does it mean for humanity to be made in the image of God comes from another English writer, J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien says that what it means to be made in the image of God is that God is a divine creator. God is a creative. God's a writer, and a divine author. And what Tolkien says is that what it means for us is that we are called to create. So again, earlier we talked about the idea of God as creator and these sort of arguments of what does it mean for God to be creator. And if God is, as creator, is giving order to chaos, then Augustine type thinking makes sense. The logical course of God as the creator who calls order out of chaos is, if we're made in the image of that God, then we should bring order to the world, that we're called to be rational beings, that we're called to try to make sense of things the way that God made sense of the world. That makes sense? But another way of thinking about God is that God is the divine creator in an artistic sort of a way, that God painted the universe into being, that God spoke the universe in the way that a poet speaks and weaves a tale that conjures up the imagination. But when God does it, it actually creates a physical thing. That God is a divine artist, and if we're made in the image of that God, it means that we're called to be narrators. We're called to be artists. We're called to tell stories. For Tolkien, that's part of our divine stamp. And so when Tolkien does research, he looks at across nations and tribes. And what Tolkien notices is that every tribe defines itself, we may call it history, but by some sort of narrative arc. Every nation has this sort of narrative way of understanding themselves. And even modern psychologists might talk about the sort of narrative way in which people form identity. A narrative can set in. I'm a great athlete, and that person will try to define their life based on that narrative. And Tolkien says that we're sort of called to make narrative because we come from the God whose narrative created the universe. Remember what we talked about in the beginning was the Word. for Tolkien, the word writes the universe into being. And in that same way, because humanity is made in the image of God, the highest form of our creation is when we are creating, when we act in the image of God when we create. And so we have this ability to create new life when we come together, but we also have this divine desire, innate desire to want to tell stories and to create narrative meaning. And so for Tolkien, that is the way in which humanity is made in the image of God. You can see when I talked about the Old and New Testament and sort of the historical analysis of how God might be creator, you can see that it logically fits with anthropology. That is, what does it mean to be human if we are made in the image of God? Now, in the modern era, another thought comes up that may be defined as natural theology. What natural theology says is that it sort of goes beyond this super focus on humanity as made in the image of God. And it says that all of creation has God's fingerprints on it. So if you go back to the idea of God as creator, but you think of it more like a potter making a clay jar, a clay jar. If you looked at a potter, you might, if you could examine microscopically, you would see the fingerprints of the person as they create and they work into it. Or even in the idea of Tolkien, if you write a story, you could see sort of the elements of the person's nature written into the story. And what natural theology says is it's not just humanity, but all of creation has God's thumbprints and fingerprints all over them. And what that means is that if we want to understand God, we have to examine creation, and creation sort of points us to God. So that's a modern sort of excursion from creation theology. That is, that all of creation is able to point us to God, which sort of lowers humanity's standing in all of it. Another part of that is another thing you may have heard of is creationism. Creationism, the idea of sort of a scientific explanation of how God is creator, is a modern effort because we are dealing with Darwinian evolutionary scientists. Because we are no longer dealing with, in the Old Testament, the way that they explained God as creator was based on trying to explain it to the nations around them. So Leviathan makes sense to them because that's the sort of powers that the nations around them accept and believe. But in the modern world and in a post-Darwin world, the idea that creation happens slowly over time means that we want to go back and look at the creation narrative and say, how does all of creation, again, it's sort of branched from natural theology, how does all of creation point back to a creator? We talked about this a little last week, right? If we looked at a watch, and we could see how all of the pieces perfectly work together so that the watch works, it points to a watchmaker. And the fact that it's a watch and not a shoe, right, it lends itself to an understanding of what the kind of person who made it. In the same way, modern scientists or scientific theologians argue in creationism that we can study creation as in a scientific sort of pursuit, and those scientific pursuits point us back to God as creator. Now, in all these things, what we're holding up, even though there might be various viewpoints, is the idea that we believe, the church believes in God the Father Almighty, all powerful, but also relational, like a father is, creator of heaven and earth. Again, remember the power of that in the early church was that heaven, spirit, and matter, that God is creator of all of it. Which means that one of the strands of modern missional movements is to say and remember that all people are made in the image of God, which means that all people have the divine fingerprints. They have some spark of goodness in them because God has left God's touch on them. You might find that in Wesleyan strands of theology, that there is human worth in every single person. And so because there is human worth in every person, we must work to help people to see their human worth in the context of their creation, in the context of being created, but also in the context of helping them to see that there's a God who created them. And so we believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all that is, invisible, visible and invisible. The Nicene Creed will go on to say. The scope of that is that God is over all and sustains all and has power, sovereignty over all. And so we can trust in that God to save us and to keep us. Amen.